The first rays of dawn on June 6, 1944, painted the English Channel in shades of crimson and gold. But beneath the deceptively peaceful waters, the largest amphibious invasion in human history was about to unfold. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder stood on the deck of the USS Satterley, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he gazed toward the French coastline that had remained under Nazi occupation for 4 long years. The weight of history pressed upon his shoulders like the heavy pack he would soon carry onto Omaha Beach. Operation Overlord, the code name for this monumental undertaking, represented the culmination of 2 years of meticulous planning, deception, and sacrifice. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had made the fateful decision just hours earlier to proceed, despite threatening weather conditions. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure would mean the prolongation of Nazi tyranny across Europe and potentially alter the course of human civilization. Across the choppy waters, more than 5,000 vessels of every conceivable type stretched toward the horizon. From massive battleships like HMS Warspite to humble landing craft packed with seasick soldiers, this armada represented the hopes and dreams of millions of oppressed Europeans. The men aboard these vessels came from diverse backgrounds: farmers from Iowa, dock workers from Liverpool, teachers from Toronto, and mechanics from Melbourne, all united by a common purpose that transcended national boundaries. Captain John Howard of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry had already completed his mission in the pre-dawn darkness, leading his glider-borne troops in a daring assault on Pegasus Bridge. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive account, D-Day, June 6, 1944, Howard's men had secured this vital crossing point over the Caen Canal in a matter of minutes, setting the stage for the larger invasion to follow. The bridge's capture would prove crucial for preventing German reinforcements from reaching the landing beaches. Meanwhile, behind the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable coastal fortification system, German defenders were beginning to realize that this was no mere diversionary raid. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had worked tirelessly to strengthen these defenses, but he was absent from his headquarters, having returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and plead with Hitler for additional panzer divisions. His absence would prove costly in the crucial first hours of the invasion. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already been fighting for hours in the Norman hedgerows, scattered across the countryside by fierce winds and anti-aircraft fire. Many had landed miles from their intended drop zones, but their courage and adaptability would become legendary. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself dangling from the church steeple in St. Mire-Église, playing dead while German soldiers searched the streets below. His survival and eventual escape would become one of the most celebrated stories of D-Day. As the landing craft approached the beaches, the full magnitude of the German defenses became apparent. Concrete bunkers bristled with machine guns, mortar, and artillery pieces, all positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandy approaches. Thousands of obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, and mines had been placed in the surf to destroy landing craft and entangle troops. The beaches themselves had been transformed into killing fields, with every approach covered by multiple weapons positions. The moment had arrived when ordinary men would be called upon to perform extraordinary acts of heroism. The ramps of the landing craft dropped with metallic clangs that were immediately drowned out by the deafening roar of German machine guns. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, stepped into hell itself as they waded through the surf toward Omaha Beach. The water, initially knee-deep, suddenly dropped away into underwater shell craters, and heavily laden soldiers disappeared beneath the waves, their equipment dragging them to watery graves. Sergeant First Class Philip Streckick watched in horror as the men around him fell like wheat before a scythe. The German MB-42 machine guns, firing at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, created a wall of lead that seemed impossible to penetrate. Bodies floated in the surf, turning the channel waters red with the blood of America's finest. The carefully planned timetable for the invasion was already falling apart as unit after unit was decimated in the killing zone. Private First Class Raymond Hoback from Virginia clutched his waterlogged rifle and crawled across the sand, using the bodies of his fallen comrades as cover. The beach was littered with abandoned equipment, backpacks, helmets, weapons, and medical supplies, all testament to the fierce resistance the Germans were mounting. Above the chaos, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery shells added another layer of terror to an already nightmarish scene. Colonel George Arthur Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment, found himself pinned down behind a Kazinkwame seawall with the remnants of several companies. The initial assault waves had been virtually annihilated, and the survivors were leaderless and demoralized. It was at this critical moment that Taylor shouted the words that would become legendary. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His rallying cry sparked a desperate charge up the bluffs that would turn the tide of battle. Meanwhile, at Utah Beach, the situation was dramatically different. The 4th Infantry Division, led by Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, had landed nearly 2 miles south of their intended target due to strong currents. Rather than attempting to relocate, the 56-year-old Roosevelt, walking with a cane due to arthritis and a heart condition, made a decision that would save countless lives. "We'll start the war from right here," he declared, and his calm leadership helped ensure that Utah Beach became the most successful of all the landing sites. The British and Canadian forces were facing their own challenges at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division encountered fierce resistance at Courseulles-sur-Mer, where German strongpoints had been carefully positioned to command the approaches. Private Rolf Jackson of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada was among the first to reach the seawall, but the cost had been enormous. His company had suffered 75% casualties in the first few minutes of the assault at Sword Beach. Lord Lovett's 1st Special Service Brigade, complete with Piper Bill Millen playing Highland war songs, advanced inland toward their objective of linking up with the airborne forces holding Pegasus Bridge. The sight of Millen striding through the battlefield, his pipes skirling ancient melodies of Scotland, provided in surreal contrast to the modern mechanized warfare raging around him. German soldiers, according to later accounts, held their fire against the piper, believing him to be a madman. The German response was hampered by confusion and conflicting orders from the highest levels of command. Hitler, believing the Normandy landings to be a feint designed to draw attention from the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais, refused to release the panzer reserves that might have driven the Allies back into the sea. General Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, pleaded for permission to deploy the 21st Panzer Division, but bureaucratic delays and Hitler's late-rising habits meant that crucial hours were lost. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, small groups of Allied soldiers began to achieve local successes that would eventually coalesce into breakthrough opportunities. By mid-morning, the beaches of Normandy resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno, yet from this chaos, individual acts of heroism began to emerge that would define the character of the entire operation. Technical Sergeant Frank Perigori of the 116th Infantry Regiment single-handedly eliminated a German machine gun nest that had been decimating his unit, crawling through a drainage ditch under heavy fire to reach a position where he could use his rifle grenades effectively. His actions opened a gap in the German defenses that allowed his company to advance off the beach. The Rangers, elite assault troops specifically trained for the most dangerous missions, were simultaneously conducting one of the most daring operations of the entire invasion. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion was scaling the 100-foot cliffs of Pointe du Hoc under direct enemy fire, their mission to destroy a battery of German artillery pieces that threatened both Omaha and Utah beaches. Using rocket-fired grappling hooks and rope ladders, these men climbed through a hail of grenades and machine gun fire, driven by the knowledge that thousands of their comrades' lives depended on their success. Sergeant Leonard Lelmo reached the top of the cliff to discover that the massive German guns were wooden decoys, the real artillery. Pieces had been moved inland to avoid Allied bombing. Undeterred, Lelmo and his fellow Rangers pushed deeper into enemy territory, eventually locating and destroying the actual gun positions with thermite grenades. Their success prevented what could have been a catastrophic bombardment of the landing. Forces dotted Omaha Beach. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Private First Class John Joseph Kelly, a radio operator from New York, had watched his unit's officers fall one by one to German sniper fire. Taking command of the demoralized survivors, Kelly organized a flanking movement that eliminated several machine gun positions. His leadership inspired other small groups to begin coordinated attacks on the German strongpoints that had seemed impregnable. Just hours earlier, the tide literally began to turn as the second wave of landing craft arrived. These vessels carried desperately needed artillery, armor, and engineers who could begin clearing the beach obstacles and establishing supply lines. Combat engineers like Sergeant William Richard Garland worked under fire to blow gaps in the German beach obstacles, creating channels through which additional troops and supplies could flow. Many of these brave men paid with their lives for each yard of progress, but their sacrifice was gradually creating the momentum needed for success. Captain Joseph Talbot Dawson of Company G, 16th Infantry Regiment, led one of the first successful assaults on the German positions atop the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. Dawson's men had suffered severe casualties during the landing, but the captain's calm leadership and tactical skill enabled them to outflank a key German strongpoint. Once on top of the bluff, Dawson's company was able to begin rolling up the German defenses from the flank, creating opportunities for other units to advance. The German defenders, despite their advantageous positions, were beginning to feel the strain of continuous combat. Many of the troops manning the Atlantic Wall were not first-line German soldiers, but rather conscripts from occupied territories, Poles, Russians, and other Eastern Europeans who had little enthusiasm for dying for the Third Reich. As Allied pressure mounted, some of these positions began to surrender, though fanatical SS and Wehrmacht units continued to fight with desperate courage. Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh, manning a machine gun position overlooking Omaha Beach, would later claim to have fired over 12,000 rounds during the battle, earning him the nickname Beast of Omaha Beach. His position, designated WN-72, commanded an excellent field of fire across the landing zone and was responsible for many Allied casualties. Yet even positions like Severloh's could not stem the tide of Allied determination and numerical superiority. By early afternoon, the character of the battle was beginning to shift from desperate survival to cautious optimism as more Allied units established footholds on the continent. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Norman countryside, the precarious Allied foothold began to solidify into something approaching a secure beachhead. Major General Leonard Talbot Gero, commanding the 5th Corps at Omaha Beach, finally felt confident enough to move his headquarters ashore, a symbolic gesture that marked the transition from amphibious assault to sustained ground operations. The beach that had been a killing field mere hours earlier was now buzzing with activity as engineers cleared obstacles, medics tended to the wounded, and supply personnel began the massive task of unloading the materials needed to sustain the invasion. The heroic actions of individual soldiers continued to create opportunities for larger tactical successes. Colonel Charles Decker Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment, wounded in the hand during the initial landing, refused medical evacuation and instead organized a coordinated assault on the village of Vierville-sur-Mer. Despite his injury, Canham personally led the attack that cleared this strategic position, opening one of the key exits from Omaha Beach. His leadership exemplified the kind of personal courage that was transforming a near disaster into a stunning victory. At the eastern end of the invasion area, British forces under Lieutenant General Miles Christopher Dempsey were making steady progress inland. The 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division had secured the port of Arromanches, which would soon become the site of one of the artificial harbors, code-named Mulberry, that would be crucial for supplying the Allied armies. Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards became the only man to receive the Victoria Cross for actions on D-Day itself, single-handedly clearing 2 German pillboxes that were holding up his battalion's advance. The airborne operations, despite the scattered nature of the initial drops, were beginning to coalesce into effective fighting forces. Major General Matthew Bunker Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division was consolidating its positions around Saint-Mir-Église, while the 101st Airborne Division, under Major General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, was securing the causeway exits behind Utah Beach. These paratroopers, many of whom had been fighting alone or in small groups since the pre-dawn hours, were proving the value of their intensive training and unshakable morale. Lieutenant Colonel Robert George Cole of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment would later receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the assault on a German battery position near Corentin. Cole's bayonet charge across open ground under heavy machine gun fire inspired his men to overwhelm a position that had been holding up the advance for hours. His action typified the aggressive spirit that characterized the American airborne forces throughout the Normandy campaign. The German response remained hampered by command confusion and the lingering effects of the Allied deception campaign. General Gunther Adolf Ferdinand Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to von Rundstedt, later wrote that the German High Command remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion until well into the afternoon of June 6. This strategic miscalculation prevented the Germans from mounting the kind of immediate, coordinated counterattack that might have driven the Allies back into the sea during the vulnerable early hours of the invasion. Nevertheless, individual German units continued to fight with the skill and determination that had made the Wehrmacht one of history's most effective fighting forces. The 21st Panzer Division, finally released from reserve, launched a counterattack that briefly reached the coast between Juno and Sword Beaches. This thrust, led by Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronichowski, created a temporary crisis as it threatened to split the British landing forces. However, the panzer attack lacked sufficient infantry support and was eventually repelled by determined resistance from Canadian and British forces supported by naval gunfire. The Royal Navy's contribution to the battle's success cannot be overstated. FMS Warspite, the veteran battleship that had fought at Jutland in the First World War, used her 15-inch guns to devastating effect against German strongpoints. The accuracy of naval gunfire, directed by forward observers ashore, proved crucial in neutralizing German positions that had survived the preliminary bombardment. Captain Frederick Cyril Dreyer, commanding the naval forces at Sword Beach, coordinated a masterful display of naval artillery that cleared the way for the advancing infantry. As evening approached, the success of Operation Overlord was no longer in doubt, though the cost had been enormous and the challenges ahead remained daunting. As darkness fell over the Norman coast on June 6, 1944, the Allied forces could claim a precarious but genuine victory. The beachheads, purchased with the blood of thousands of brave men, stretched along 60 miles of coastline, from the Cotentin Peninsula to the Orne River. Yet the commanders knew that D-Day was merely the beginning of what would become a grinding campaign to liberate Western Europe from Nazi occupation. The casualty figures painted a stark picture of the day's cost. At Omaha Beach alone, American forces had suffered over 2,000 casualties, with some units experiencing losses exceeding 90%. The 1st Infantry Division's 16th Infantry Regiment had been virtually destroyed as an effective fighting force, yet the survivors continued to hold their positions and prepare for the inevitable German counterattacks. Private First Class Carlton Walter Barrett, a radio operator who had lost his entire squad during the landing, spent the night calling in naval gunfire support that helped repel several German probing attacks. The medical personnel who had landed with the assault waves performed miracles under impossible conditions. Captain Charles Shekels, a battalion surgeon with the 116th Infantry Regiment, established an aid station in a bomb crater just 50 yards from the German positions. Working without adequate supplies and under constant sniper fire, Shekels and his medics saved countless lives during those first crucial hours. Many wounded soldiers owed their survival to the heroic efforts of medics like Private First Class Charles Norman Shea, a Native American from Maine, who repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded comrades from the surf. The engineering units faced perhaps the most difficult challenge of all: establishing the infrastructure needed to support a major military campaign. The Germans had systematically destroyed every port facility along the Norman coast, forcing the Allies to rely on their ingenious artificial harbors and the gradual improvement of beach landing facilities. Lieutenant Colonel William Alexander, steer of the Royal Engineers, supervised the placement of the first Mulberry Harbor components at Arromanches, a massive undertaking that required precise coordination between naval and engineering forces behind the German lines. The resistance movements that had been organized and supplied by the Special Operations Executive and the Office of Strategic Services were conducting a campaign of sabotage that significantly hampered German reinforcement efforts. The French resistance, organized into groups like the Maquis, had been cutting telephone lines, destroying railway tracks, and ambushing German supply convoys throughout the night. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, leader of the Alliance Network, coordinated intelligence gathering operations that provided the Allies with crucial information about German troop movements and defensive positions. The Luftwaffe's absence from the skies over Normandy told its own story about the changing fortunes of war. The once mighty German Air Force could muster only 300 sorties on D-Day, compared to the Allies' 14,700. Colonel Joseph Priller and his wingmen flew one of the few German air attacks against the invasion fleet, strafing Sword Beach in their Focke-Wulf 190 fighters before returning to their base in France. Their lonely mission symbolized the Luftwaffe's inability to contest Allied air superiority. The success of the airborne operations became more apparent as scattered units linked up and began operating as cohesive forces. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Joseph Cassidy of the 1st Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, had assembled men from multiple units to defend the village of Saint-Mère-Église against determined German counterattacks. His mixed force of paratroopers, glider infantry, and even some lost sailors from the beach landings held their positions throughout the night, preventing the Germans from recapturing this vital crossroads. The human cost of the operation extended far beyond the military casualties. French civilians in the invasion zone had endured years of occupation followed by intensive Allied bombing in the weeks leading up to D-Day. The town of Caen, a key Allied objective, had been heavily damaged by bombing raids, and many civilians were trapped in the ruins. Despite the dangers, French civilians like Leon Gautier, a young man from Ouistreham, guided Allied troops through the maze of defensive positions, providing invaluable local knowledge that saved many lives. As the night wore on, both sides prepared for the larger battle that would determine the fate of Hitler's Atlantic Wall and the future of Nazi-occupied Europe. The second day of Operation Overlord began with a renewed sense of purpose among the Allied forces, though the challenges ahead remained formidable. General Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces during the initial phase of the invasion, established his headquarters at Cruilly, a small Norman village that would serve as the nerve center for the expanding campaign. Montgomery's confident leadership and meticulous planning had been instrumental in the invasion's success, though his sometimes abrasive personality would later create tensions with his American counterparts. The link-up of the scattered beachheads became the primary objective for June 7th. At Gold Beach, the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division pushed inland toward Bayeux, the first major French city to be liberated. The division's advance was spearheaded by the 6th Green Howards, whose commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robin Hastings McNair, had been killed during the initial assault. His replacement, Major Ronald Lofthouse, led the battalion in a series of sharp engagements that cleared the road to Bayeux, opening the way for the rapid expansion of the Allied beachhead. The German response was beginning to show signs of the organizational problems that would plague their defensive efforts throughout the Normandy campaign. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the 7th Army, had been caught completely off guard by the invasion and was struggling to coordinate an effective counterattack. The German military's rigid command structure, which required approval from higher headquarters for major tactical decisions, proved ill-suited to the fluid nature of the developing battle. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who would soon replace von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West, later admitted that the German Army's failure to mount an immediate, massive counterattack on June 7th was one of the critical errors of the entire campaign. The 21st Panzer Division's piecemeal attacks had been easily repelled, and the opportunity to exploit the Allies' vulnerable position during the first few days was rapidly slipping away. The logistical miracle of supplying the invasion force was beginning to take shape along the Norman coast. The Mulberry harbors, prefabricated in British shipyards and towed across the English Channel, were being assembled with remarkable speed. These artificial ports would eventually handle more cargo than many major peacetime harbors, providing the material foundation for the Allied advance across Western Europe. Commodore John Hughes Hallett, who had been instrumental in developing the Mulberry concept, supervised the installation of the first harbor sections at Arromanches, creating a facility that would operate for 10 months and handle over 4 million tons of supplies. The role of the French civilian population in the liberation of their homeland cannot be overstated. Despite years of occupation and the inevitable destruction that accompanied modern warfare, French civilians provided invaluable assistance to the Allied forces. Dr. Pierre Andrieu, the mayor of Arromanches, not only welcomed the British forces, but also organized civilian volunteers to help with the wounded and provide local intelligence about German positions. His cooperation typified the reception that Allied forces received in most Norman communities. The expanding Allied presence in Normandy was already having strategic effects far beyond the immediate battle zone. Hitler's order to hold every position along the Atlantic Wall meant that German forces were being drawn into a battle of attrition that they could not win. The Führer's insistence on fighting for every yard of French soil would ultimately lead to the destruction of entire German armies, as mobile defense strategies that might have prolonged the war were abandoned in favor of static defense that played to Allied strengths. General Dwight David Eisenhower, visiting the beachhead on June 8th, was struck by the transformation that had occurred in just 2 days. The beaches that had been scenes of carnage and chaos were now bustling with activity as engineers improved the landing facilities and supply personnel worked around the clock to build up the material strength of the invasion force. Eisenhower's decision to proceed with the invasion, despite questionable weather conditions, was being vindicated by the rapid expansion of Allied capabilities ashore. The success of the Normandy landings was already reverberating throughout occupied Europe, providing hope to resistance movements and oppressed populations from Norway to Greece. The psychological impact of the invasion was perhaps as important as its immediate military consequences, demonstrating that Nazi Germany was no longer invincible and that liberation was possible. 3 weeks after D-Day, as Allied forces consolidated their positions in the expanding Normandy beachhead, the true magnitude of what had been accomplished began to emerge. The invasion that had begun with such desperate uncertainty had evolved into a sustained campaign that would ultimately liberate Western Europe and bring the Third Reich to its knees. The cost had been enormous, over 10,000 Allied casualties on D-Day alone, but the sacrifice had purchased something beyond price, the beginning of the end for Nazi tyranny. The Battle of Normandy would continue for another 2 months, culminating in the breakout from the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. But the foundation for that victory had been laid in the first few hours of June 6th, when ordinary men from democratic nations had demonstrated that courage and determination could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The lessons learned on the beaches of Normandy would echo through military history, establishing principles of combined arms warfare, joint operations, and international cooperation that remain relevant today. The individual heroes of D-Day came from every walk of life and every corner of the Allied nations. Sergeant John Robert Slaughter of the 29th Infantry Division, who had survived the carnage at Omaha Beach, went on to fight across Europe and eventually returned home to Virginia, where he became a teacher and spent decades sharing the story of his generation's sacrifice with young Americans. His memoir, Omaha Beach and Beyond, provides one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the invasion and its aftermath. Private First Class Joseph Samuel Pilk, a medic with the 4th Infantry Division at Utah Beach, epitomized the courage of the many unsung heroes who made the invasion possible. Despite being wounded twice during the first day, Pilk continued to treat casualties under fire, saving dozens of lives through his medical skill and personal bravery. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, but like so many veterans, he rarely spoke of his wartime experiences until late in life. The French civilians who had endured 4 years of occupation finally began to taste freedom as Allied forces pushed inland from the beachheads. Madame Simone Renaud, the mayor of Sainte-Mère-Église, worked tirelessly to assist the American paratroopers who had liberated her town. Her efforts to preserve the memory of the American soldiers who had died in the liberation of her community led to the establishment of the Airborne Museum, which today welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors annually to learn about the heroism of June 6, 1940-4. The technological innovations pioneered for Operation Overlord had lasting impacts far beyond the military sphere. Artificial harbors, specialized landing craft, and coordination systems developed for the invasion contributed to advances in civil engineering, maritime transport, and communications technology. The massive logistical undertaking required to supply the invasion force provided lessons in organization and management that influenced business practices for decades after the war. The strategic deception campaign that preceded D-Day, Operation Fortitude, demonstrated the crucial importance of intelligence warfare in modern conflict. The successful misdirection of German attention away from Normandy showed how information could be as powerful as conventional weapons in determining the outcome of military operations. These lessons would prove invaluable during the Cold War and continue to influence military thinking today. Perhaps most importantly, the success of Operation Overlord demonstrated the power of international cooperation in the face of totalitarian aggression. The invasion force included troops from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, France, Poland, Norway, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and other nations united in their commitment to democratic values and human freedom. This coalition represented not just military alliance, but a meeting of minds and hearts that transcended national boundaries. The legacy of D-Day extends far beyond the military history books. The courage displayed on the beaches of Normandy inspired generations of men and women to stand up against oppression and injustice wherever they might be found. The veterans of the invasion, many of whom went on to build the prosperous, democratic societies of the post-war era, embodied the values for which they had fought: freedom, justice, and human dignity. As the last veterans of D-Day pass from the scene, their story becomes even more precious. The beaches of Normandy, now peaceful and welcoming to tourists from around the world, stand as eternal monuments to the price of freedom and the courage of those who are willing to pay it. The American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, contains the graves of 9,387 Americans who gave their lives for the liberation of Europe. Each white marble cross represents not just a soldier who died, but a family that grieved, a community that mourned, and a nation that honored its fallen heroes. The Battle of Normandy proved that democracy, for all its apparent weaknesses and inefficiencies, possesses a strength that totalitarian regimes cannot match: the willingness of free people to sacrifice everything for principles larger than themselves. On June 6, 1944, that strength was displayed in all its terrible beauty on the blood-soaked sands of Normandy, where heroes were made and history was changed forever. The bold operation that began with such uncertainty had indeed led to Europe's liberation, just as the title of this story proclaims. But more than that, it had demonstrated that the forces of freedom, when united in common cause, are ultimately unstoppable. That lesson, purchased with such sacrifice on the beaches of Normandy, remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago.